On a Tuesday morning in September of 2019, I was sitting in the cab of my grandfather's 1987 John Deere 4450 in the middle of a cornfield outside Winterset, Iowa, watching the yield monitor display numbers that should have felt like relief after 3 years of decisions that had not gone the way I planned them. And the combine was running and the corn was coming in stronger than August had any right to be after the wet spring we'd had. And I had my hand on the header controls and my eyes on the standing corn ahead of me, and I was doing the thing I had been doing for 21 years, since my grandfather, August Arden, handed me the keys to this machine in the summer of 1998, which was farming the same 280 acres he had farmed before me, and his father had farmed before him. And then the 4450 did something it had never done in 32 years of operation, something that the machine's service history and its maintenance record and the care I had given it since the morning August put the keys in my hand gave me no reason to expect, which was stop, completely and without warning. Not a gradual loss of power and not a fault code on the display, and not a sound that gave me a second to prepare. Just stop. Engine cutting to silence in the middle of a field, in the middle of a harvest on a September morning when the corn was ready and the weather was holding, and there was no mechanical reason in the world for the machine to be anything other than running. And the silence that replaced the engine sound was the most complete silence I had experienced in 21 years of farming that field. And I sat in the cab for a long moment, looking at the stopped display and the standing corn ahead of me and the harvested rows behind me, and felt something move through me that I could not immediately identify, something that was not frustration and was not panic, but was older and quieter than either of those things. And then I heard my grandfather's voice as clearly as I had heard it on the last morning he was well enough to sit beside me on this machine, 21 years ago, saying the words he had said to me then that I had spent 21 years believing I understood, and had in fact spent 21 years getting completely wrong. August Arden died on August 14, 1998, which was 3 weeks after the last morning we sat together in the equipment shed with the 4450 idling between us, and he said what he said. And he died the way he had lived, without drama and without complaint, and with the particular dignity of a man who has made his peace with everything that required making peace with, and has nothing left unfinished, except the things that cannot be finished by the person leaving, but only by the people staying. And I was 19 years old, and I had just finished my first year at Iowa State, and I had not yet decided whether farming was what I wanted to do with my life, or whether it was simply what I had always been surrounded by, and had mistaken for a calling, because I had never been far enough from it to see it clearly. And August had known this about me with the accuracy that grandparents sometimes have about the grandchildren they have watched most closely, had known that I was at the edge of a decision that would shape everything that followed, and had decided, with the economy of a man who understood that the time remaining to him was shorter than the list of things he wanted to say, to compress everything he most needed me to know into the fewest words that could carry it. We were in the equipment shed on a Saturday morning in late July, the Iowa heat already building by 8 o'clock, and August had asked me to help him check the 4450's hydraulic fluid before he started the day's work, and I had helped him, and we had climbed up onto the machine together the way we had climbed onto it together since I was small enough that August lifted me up with one hand, and August had let the engine idle for a few minutes the way he always did, listening to it with the focused attention of a man for whom an engine's sound is a language he has been reading for 50 years. And then he had turned to me and said, "Thomas, this machine will tell you when you're pushing too hard. The question is whether you're listening." And I had looked at him and nodded the way a 19-year-old nods when an old man says something that sounds like wisdom and probably is wisdom, but is not yet translatable into the specific terms of a life not yet lived. And August had looked at me for a moment with the expression I would spend 21 years trying to fully remember, and had said nothing more. Just climbed down from the machine with the careful deliberateness that his body required by that July, and walked back toward the farmhouse. And I had sat on the 4450 alone for a while, listening to the engine idle and thinking about what he had said, and arriving at what seemed like the obvious interpretation, which was that the 4450 was an aging machine and that I should pay attention to its performance indicators and not push it beyond what it could reliably deliver. And I had filed the advice in the category of practical instruction about equipment maintenance and had carried it there for 21 years without once questioning whether the category was correct. My father, Raymond, had not wanted the farm, had left Winterset for Des Moines in 1979 when he was 22 years old, and had built a life there that had nothing to do with soil or equipment or the particular rhythm of a farming year. And when August died and left the farm and the 4450 and the 280 acres to me rather than to Raymond, Raymond had called me and said, "Thomas, your grandfather left you everything." And I had said, "I know." And Raymond had said, "Are you going to farm it?" And I had said yes before he finished the sentence, because the answer had been yes since the first morning August lifted me onto the 4450 and let me sit in the cab with the engine running and the Iowa fields stretching away from us in every direction, and the world feeling from that height in that seat like something that could be worked and understood and cared for if a man was patient enough and attentive enough and willing to show up for it every morning, regardless of what the morning asked of him, which was the only philosophy August had ever articulated about farming, and which I had taken as my own so completely that I could not have told you where his ended and mine began. The 21 years between August's death in 1998 and the September morning when the 4450 stopped in my cornfield were not 21 uniform years, but 21 years of distinct seasons and distinct decisions that accumulated into the shape of a life, the way seasons always accumulate, not dramatically and not according to any plan, but through the steady pressure of circumstance meeting character and producing outcomes that neither element could have predicted independently. And the early years were good years, the years when I was learning the farm the way August had always said it needed to be learned, which was slowly and from the ground up, starting with the soil itself before the equipment, and the equipment before the finances, and the finances before any thought of expansion. And I farmed the original 280 acres for the first 7 years with the patient conservatism of a man who understood that he was the steward of something that predated him and would outlast him, and that his primary obligation was to leave it in better condition than he had found it. And those 7 years produced modest yields and modest income and a cost structure so lean that 2 consecutive bad harvests would not have threatened the operation's survival. And I thought about August often during those years, thought about his instructions and his example, and the way he had moved through the farm with the unhurried deliberateness of a man for whom the work itself was the point, and the outcome was simply the work's honest report on itself. I married Sarah Connolly in 2003, a woman from outside Adele who had grown up on a farm and who understood the life without requiring explanation. And Sarah had the particular combination of practical intelligence and emotional steadiness that farming asks of the people who choose it, the ability to hold a long view when the short view is discouraging, and to find meaning in the seasonal repetition that exhausts people who need novelty and nourishes people who need depth. And the first years of our marriage had the quality of something built correctly from the foundation. Nothing spectacular and nothing fragile, just solid and functional and capable of bearing what life was eventually going to put on top of it. Or so I believed, in 2003 and 2004 and 2005, when the belief was easy and the evidence supported it, and the 4450 was running clean and the soil was responding to the care I was giving it, and August's words about the machine telling me when I was pushing too hard seemed like advice I was successfully following, because the machine was not telling me anything alarming, and I was not pushing anything beyond its demonstrated capacity. The first expansion came in 2006 when the Halverson farm, adjacent to my north fence line, came available, and I bought 120 additional acres at a price that required borrowing more than I was comfortable borrowing, but that the bank's numbers and the commodity projections and the general optimism of the mid-2000s agricultural economy supported sufficiently that I signed the note and absorbed the acres and told myself that August would have done the same if the opportunity had presented presented itself at the right moment in his farming life, which was probably true, and was also the first instance of something I would do with increasing frequency over the following decade, which was invoke August's name in support of a decision I had already made, rather than ask honestly whether the decision was one August would actually have made, because those are different things, and the difference between them is important, and I was not yet ready to sit with the importance. Sarah was cautious about the Halverson purchase in a way that I heard as practical concern and addressed with projected income numbers, and that I understand now, 21 years after August's words and 3 years after Sarah stopped being able to reach me through any language I was listening to, as something more than practical concern, as the specific unease of a person who can see a direction forming before the person choosing the direction can see it themselves. And I gave her the projected income numbers, and she accepted them because accepting them was the reasonable response to a reasonable presentation, and because she trusted my judgment the way you trust the judgment of someone who has given you consistent reason to trust it, and who has not yet given you reason not to. And we absorbed the 120 Halverson acres and paid the note down over 4 years, and by 2010 the expansion had vindicated itself on paper, and I had the specific confidence of a man whose first significant risk has come out on the right side, and who has therefore received the worst possible preparation for the next one, which is the conviction that his judgment about risk is sound, when what the outcome has actually demonstrated is that the market was cooperative, and the weather was adequate, and the borrowed money had a long enough runway to become productive before it became dangerous. The second expansion came in 2013, and the third in 2015, and by 2016 I was farming 520 acres with a debt structure that required commodity prices to stay within a range that commodity prices have no obligation to stay within, and an equipment maintenance budget that had been compressed 3 consecutive years to service the land debt, and that was producing in the 4450 and the other machines on the operation the early signs of deferred care that a man who is paying attention to his equipment rather than his balance sheets would have caught and addressed before they became the kind of problems that stop machines in the middle of fields during harvest. And Sarah had said to me in the spring of 2016, "Thomas, I feel like I'm watching something happen that I can't stop." And I had said, "What do you mean?" And she had said, "I mean you're pushing everything past what it was designed for and you're not hearing it." And I had looked at her and heard the words and processed them as concern about finances rather than as something larger, and had said, "The numbers are tight, but they're manageable." And Sarah had looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 13 years of marriage, and had said, "I'm not talking about the numbers." And I had not known what she was talking about and had said so, and she had said, "I know you don't." And the conversation had ended there, and I had gone back to my desk and my spreadsheets and my commodity futures charts, and Sarah had gone somewhere I was not paying enough attention to follow. And the 4450 had sat in the equipment shed with its deferred maintenance accumulating the way debt accumulates, invisibly and steadily, and with the patient certainty of something that will eventually demand to be addressed on its own terms, rather than on the terms the person who created it would prefer. Sarah left in the spring of 2018, not dramatically and not with anger, but with the specific quiet of a woman who has been trying to be heard for 2 years and has finally accepted that the person she needs to hear her is not currently capable of it. And she packed what she needed and drove to her sister's place outside Adel and called me that evening and said, "Thomas, I love you, and I am not leaving because I stopped loving you. I am leaving because staying stopped being something I could do without losing something I can't afford to lose." And I had sat at the kitchen table after the call with the phone in my hand and felt the specific hollowness of a man who has been told something true about himself that he cannot immediately refute and cannot immediately accept, and therefore sits with it unresolved in the space where resolution should be. And I had thought about Sarah's words from 2016, the ones about pushing everything past what it was designed for and not hearing it, and I had felt for the first time a faint and uncomfortable resonance between those words and August's words from 1998, a resonance I was not yet ready to follow to its conclusion, but that was present in the kitchen that evening in a way it had not been present before, like something that has been in a room for a long time finally catching the light at the right angle to become visible. I did not stop farming after Sarah left, did not slow down or simplify or make any of the adjustments that the situation was clearly asking me to make, and the reason I did not was the same reason I had not heard Sarah for 2 years and not heard August's words correctly for 20 years, which was that stopping and slowing down and simplifying required a kind of attention to myself that I had never developed because August's farm and August's example and the particular culture of the Iowa farming community I had grown up in all pointed in the same direction, which was outward, toward the land and the crop and the equipment and the weather and the market, and the attention that pointed inward toward the person doing the farming was not something the culture rewarded or the example modeled or the work itself demanded, except in the indirect and patient way that all sustained endeavors eventually demand it, which is by producing the consequences of its absence until the absence becomes impossible to ignore. And I had not yet reached the point of impossibility in the spring of 2018, was still one season away from it, still capable of absorbing the loss of Sarah into the operating costs of a life pushed past its design capacity and continuing to function at a level that looked from the outside like a man managing a difficult period and looked from the inside like a man running on the last reserves of something he had never thought to replenish because he had never imagined it could run out.
Chet Dooley came over in the summer of 2018, drove his truck down the county road and parked in my driveway the way he had been parking in my driveway since before I was old enough to remember driveways, and sat on the porch with me in the evening light and said nothing for a while in the way that Chet said nothing, which was not emptily, but with the specific fullness of a man who has something to say and is choosing the right moment to say it. And then he said, "Thomas, how are you doing?" And I said, "I'm managing." And Chet said, "That's not what I asked." And I looked at him and said, "I'm tired, Chet." And Chet said, "What kind of tired?" And I said, "The kind that sleep doesn't fix." And Chet nodded and looked out at the fields and said, "Your grandfather used to say that the land reflects the farmer, that healthy ground comes from a healthy man, and struggling ground comes from a struggling one." And I said, "August said a lot of things." And Chet said, "He did, and most of them took a while to understand." And I looked at Chet and felt the resonance again, the same faint, uncomfortable resonance from the kitchen in April when Sarah left, the sense of something trying to reach me through language I was almost but not quite ready to receive. And Chet said, "He talked about you a lot in his last years, Thomas, said you had his father's eyes for the land and his own tendency to push past the point of wisdom." And I said, "He said that?" And Chet said, "He worried about it, the pushing. He said the land would teach you eventually, but he hoped it didn't have to teach you the hard way." And I said, "What did he mean by the hard way?" And Chet looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man deciding how directly to answer a question that the person asking it may not be ready for the direct answer to. And then he said, "I think he meant the way it taught him." And I said, "What way was that?" And Chet said, "That's his story to tell, Thomas, not mine." And I said, "He's been gone 20 years, Chet." And Chet said, "I know." And we sat in silence for a while after that, and I thought about August pushing past the point of wisdom and wondered what that had looked like and when it had happened and how the land had taught him and whether the teaching had arrived in time to matter. And I did not ask Chet anything more about it because the question felt too large for a porch conversation in the summer evening right, and because some part of me understood that the answer was not something Chet could give me, but something I was going to have to arrive at myself through whatever remained of the process that Sarah's leaving and Chet's words and 21 years of an instruction I had been misreading were collectively and patiently trying to move me toward. And I went to bed that night and lay in the farmhouse that August had built and listened to the Iowa summer outside the window and thought about the 4450 in the equipment shed with its deferred maintenance and its 32 years of operation and the words August had said sitting on it in the July heat of 1998 and felt for the first time in 21 years genuinely uncertain about what those words had meant. Not the equipment interpretation I had always carried, but the other interpretation, the one that had been available all along in the words themselves if I had been ready to hear it, which I had not been in 1998 and had not been in any of the years between then and this summer evening in 2018, but which was getting closer to available with every month that the life I had built on the wrong understanding of everything August had tried to tell me continued producing the consequences of that misunderstanding.
The harvest of 2019 began on a Monday in the second week of September with the specific combination of anxiety and purpose that every harvest carries, but that this one carried more heavily than any previous one in my 21 years of farming August's ground. Because the 2019 season was the season in which the accumulated weight of 3 years of decisions made past the point of wisdom was going to resolve itself into numbers that either justified the pushing or confirmed what Sarah had seen forming in 2016 and what Chet had pointed toward on the porch in 2018 and what some part of me had been circling without landing since the kitchen evening in April when Sarah's car had turned out of the driveway and taken with it the last person who had been trying to tell me something I was not yet capable of hearing. And I started the 4450 on that Monday morning with the focused determination of a man who has decided that the outcome of the next 30 days is going to be determined entirely by how hard he works and how long he runs and how completely he commits to the harvest as the solution to everything the preceding 3 years had accumulated, which was the wrong decision in the same way that all my decisions since 2013 had been wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being foolish or uninformed, but wrong in the deeper sense of being made from the wrong place in myself, the place that believed more effort and longer hours and greater commitment of will were always the correct response to difficulty, the place that had never learned that some problems are not solved by pushing harder, but are in fact created by pushing harder, and can only be resolved by the opposite of pushing, by stopping and listening and receiving what the situation is trying to tell you rather than overwhelming it with the force of your own determination. I ran the 4450 12 hours on Monday and 14 hours on Tuesday and 15 hours on Wednesday, pushing the harvest with the urgency of a man whose debt structure required a specific yield outcome and whose weather window was showing a system moving in from the northwest that the forecast said would arrive in 10 to 12 days and that I was determined to beat. And the machine ran without complaint through those first 3 days, ran with the steady reliability that 32 years of good maintenance by August and 21 years of adequate maintenance by me had built into it, and I took that reliability as confirmation that the decision to push was correct, and did not hear in it what I would understand 3 days later it had actually been saying, which was that a machine's willingness to run beyond its comfortable operating parameters is not permission to run it there, is not the machine telling you the pushing is fine, but is simply the machine doing what machines do when they have been built well and maintained adequately, which is absorb more than they should before they tell you they have absorbed enough. And the telling, when it came the way August's words had always been trying to tell me something, without drama and without negotiation, and at the exact moment when the hearing of it was most necessary and most possible.
On Thursday morning, September 19, 2019, at 7:23 in the morning, with 180 acres of standing corn still ahead of me and the Northwest system now showing 8 days out rather than 10, and my debt service calculation requiring a yield outcome that the remaining 180 acres needed to deliver without compromise, the 4450 stopped in the middle of the field, and the silence that replaced the engine sound was the same silence I described at the beginning of this story, the most complete silence I had experienced in 21 years of farming that field. And I sat in the cab looking at the stopped display and the standing corn and the harvested rows and the flat Iowa morning stretching away from me in every direction, and I heard August's voice say, "Thomas, this machine will tell you when you're pushing too hard. The question is whether you're listening." And this time, for the first time in 21 years, the words did not land in the category of equipment maintenance advice, but somewhere else entirely. somewhere older and more personal and more directly addressed to the man sitting in the stopped cab on the September morning than any advice about hydraulic fluid or engine hours could ever have been. And I sat with the landing for a long time, long enough for the standing corn ahead of me and the debt service calculation and the northwest weather system to recede from the center of my awareness and for something else to take their place, which was the full and unobstructed understanding of what my grandfather had been trying to tell a 19-year-old boy in a July equipment shed in 1998, that the 19-year-old boy had not been old enough or honest enough with himself to receive, which was that the pushing he was warning me about was never the tractor's pushing, but mine, was never about hydraulic pressure or engine load, but about the specific and inherited tendency in me to exceed the limits of what I and the people around me and the ground beneath me could sustainably bear. The tendency to convert commitment into compulsion and dedication into the kind of relentless forward pressure that looks from the outside like strength and feels from the inside like the only available option, and produces in the end the stopping that a man could have chosen voluntarily at any earlier point, but chose instead to have imposed on him by the accumulated weight of everything he refused to hear when the hearing was still comfortable. And I climbed down from the cab of the 4450 and stood in the Iowa cornfield in the September morning and felt 21 years of misunderstanding settle into their correct shape around me, with the specific relief of a thing that has been held in the wrong position for a long time finally being allowed to rest in the right one. And Chet Dooley, who had been running his own combine in the adjacent field, saw the 4450 stopped and drove over and climbed down and walked through the corn to where I was standing and said, "Thomas?" And I said, "It stopped, Chet." And Chet looked at the machine and then at me and said, "The machine or you?" And I said, "Both." And Chet stood beside me in the field and said nothing, because nothing was required. And both of us understood that the stopped machine and the standing corn and the debt service calculation and the northwest weather system were all less important in this moment than the thing that had just happened in the space between August's words and my finally hearing them. And we stood together in the September morning in the way that two men stand together when one of them has just arrived somewhere that the other one has been waiting for him to arrive for a very long time.
I climbed back into the cab of the 4450 after Chet walked back to his combine. Climbed back in not to start it, but to sit in it the way I had sat in it hundreds of times since 1998 and thousands of times in memory before that. Sat in the seat that August had worn to the shape of a man who spent 30 years in it and that had never quite reformed itself to my different shape in the 21 years since. And I sat in the stopped machine in the middle of the Iowa cornfield and looked at the instrument panel and the stopped display and the standing corn visible through the cab glass and felt the full weight of 21 years of a single misunderstanding pressing itself into its correct form around me. And then I did something I had never done in 21 years of operating the 4450, something I had no conscious reason to do and no explanation for, except that the morning had already produced things I had no explanation for, and one more was not going to change the character of it, which was to reach up and pull down the sun visor above the left side of the cab, the visor that August had used to block the early morning eastern sun during the planting seasons when he ran the machine before sunrise, the visor I had pulled down hundreds of times for the same purpose without ever looking at its back surface, and taped to the back of the visor with yellowed tape that had held for 21 years through Iowa summers and Iowa winters and the vibration of a working tractor running 12 and 14 and 15-hour days, was a folded piece of paper in August's handwriting that had been there since the day before he died, and that I had never known existed, and that I held in my hands in the stopped cab in the September cornfield, and unfolded with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that what he is about to read has been waiting for him specifically for 21 years and deserves the full attention of the person it was written for. The note was 3 paragraphs in August's handwriting, the handwriting of a man whose hands were more accustomed to equipment than to pens, but who had taken the time to write carefully and legibly because he was writing for a reader he loved, and the legibility was a form of respect for that love. And the first paragraph said, "Thomas, if you are reading this, then the machine has stopped and you have finally stopped with it, which means you are ready for what I could not make you ready for in the equipment shed in July." And I sat with that sentence for a long time before reading further, because the sentence was doing something to me that sentences rarely do, which was arriving with the full weight of the person who wrote it and the full weight of the 21 years between the writing and the reading, compressed into 23 words that knew exactly where I was and exactly what had just happened, and had been waiting patiently in the dark behind a sun visor for the moment when I would be ready to receive them. And the moment was now, and I was ready, and August had known I would be ready eventually, the way grandparents know things about the grandchildren they have watched most closely, not because they can predict the future, but because they have lived enough of their own to recognize its patterns in the people coming behind them. The second paragraph said, "The machine was never what I was talking about. You probably know that now. I was talking about you, about the thing in you that is also in me, the thing that converts caring into pushing and commitment into something that costs everyone around you more than it should. I pushed your grandmother past the point of wisdom for 11 years before the land taught me what I am trying to teach you now. She stayed because she was Vera, and staying was who she was, but the 11 years cost her something she never fully recovered, and I have carried that since 1971, and I am telling you now so you do not carry the equivalent of it from whatever year it is when this machine stops and you read these words." And I sat in the cab and thought about Vera, about my grandmother who had died in 2011, with the particular quietness that had always characterized her. And I thought about 11 years and what they had cost her and what August had carried since 1971. And I thought about Sarah and 2016 and the spring of 2018 and the kitchen evening when her car turned out of the driveway. And I understood that August had not been warning me about something that might happen, but about something he had watched forming in me from the beginning, the same thing that had formed in him and that the land had taught him through the only lesson it knows how to give, which is the lesson of consequence, patient and complete, and perfectly timed.
The third paragraph said, "The ground will still be there when you are ready to come back to it. Ground is patient in a way that people cannot always be. Fix what needs fixing in yourself first, and then fix the machine, and then come back to the harvest. Not because the harvest is unimportant, but because you are more important than the harvest, and the people who love you are more important than the harvest." And I needed someone to tell me that in 1971, and nobody did. And so I am telling you now, from 1998, or whenever this finds you, go call Sarah. And that was the end of the note. 3 paragraphs and an instruction so direct and so specific and so perfectly calibrated to the exact situation I was sitting in that the only possible response was the one I gave it, which was to sit in the stopped cab in the September cornfield and cry in the way that men cry when they have been carrying something too long and have finally been given permission to set it down. Not weakness, but the specific release of a weight held past the point of wisdom by a man who did not know it was a weight until the moment it was lifted. I called Chet on his mobile and asked him if he could finish my remaining acres, and Chet said, "That's what neighbors are for." And I said, "I'll explain later." And Chet said, "You don't have to explain anything, Thomas. Your grandfather asked me to keep an eye on you 21 years ago, and I told him I would, and I have. And I think today is the day I can tell him I did what I said I'd do." And I climbed down from the 4450 for the last time that season and walked out of the cornfield and drove to Adel and knocked on Sarah's sister's door. And Sarah answered and looked at me for a long moment on the doorstep. And I said, "I found the note." And Sarah said, "What note?" And I said, "The one August left in the tractor." And Sarah said nothing, but stepped back from the door in the way that a person steps back when they are making room for something they have been waiting for, without knowing exactly what form it would take when it arrived. And I came inside, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything. About August, and the words in the equipment shed in 1998, and the 21 years of the wrong interpretation, and the September morning when the 4450 stopped, and the note behind the sun visor, and the 3 paragraphs, and the last line, "Go call Sarah." And Sarah listened to all of it without speaking, and when she finished, she said, "He knew." And I said, "He knew everything. He just couldn't make me ready to hear it before I was ready." And Sarah said, "Are you ready now?" And I said, "Yes." And I meant it in the complete way that you mean something when 21 years of your life have converged on a single morning to make the meaning unavoidable.
and outside the Iowa autumn was doing what Iowa autumns do, moving toward harvest and toward the end of one season and the beginning of another. And the 4450 was in the field with Chet, finishing the corn that August had planted the first version of 50 years ago, on ground that had been teaching the men who worked it everything they most needed to know for as long as men had been working it. Patient and complete and perfectly timed, the way August had always been patient with me, the way the note had been patient behind the visor for 21 years, waiting for the morning when the machine stopped and the man finally stopped with it, and the words that had always been true became the words that could finally be heard.